Today we will be reading Mr. Linden's Library from our HMH textbook, module number 9. The genre we will explore is mysteries. And mysteries are stories in which the main character sets out to solve a mystery, crime, or other puzzle. Think about the title and genre of this text. What could be mysterious about a library or a book? Before we begin reading, let's explore some vocabulary words that we will encounter in today's mystery. Our first word is eerie. Eerie means mysterious and frightening or weird. Our next word is merchant. That means one who buys goods and sells them for a profit, similar to an H-E-B store or Walmart. Then we have the word buff. Buff is someone with an ongoing fascination for all things historical, who visits castles and stately homes for pleasure. And lastly, we have the word irresistible, which means impossible not to give in to or resist, like that irresistible piece of chocolate cake that you really want. Some things we need to know before we begin reading is that this text is set after the Civil War. During this time, African Americans dealt with discrimination and were treated inferior because of their race. Our text, Mr. Linden's Library, is a mystery about a girl named Carol who loves to read and goes on a journey to discover the secret behind Mr. Linden's book. Mr. Linden's Library. As I read today, your thinking job will be to think about the traits you notice in our main character, Carol. You wouldn't see anything special about Josiah Linden's house if you passed it on the road, which ran from the town up to the small bluff that overlooked Allen's Bay. A scrawny oak tree, gnarled and twisted from years of catching the wind off the bay, sat in front, spoiling what symmetry the old house ever had. The backside of the house looked fairly formidable, especially the rounded corner that seemed for all the world like the turret of a small castle. There were some nights, however, when the moon was full or nearly so, that the corner of the house would glow white against the darkness of the trees and shrubbery behind it and take on an eerie glow. Which words and phrases help you picture Josiah Linden's house? Carol Jenkins didn't know much about Mr. Linden except that he was one of the few Black people in the north area of Nova Scotia. The story about him mostly gathered from the lips of people curious about the old man or from the American Revolutionary War buffs who knew that his ancestors could have been among the ex-slaves who had sided with British. Was that Mr. Linden had been a merchant seaman most of his life. He wasn't a big man, and when he walked, he shifted his weight more from side to side than straight forward. He was lively, though, and always had a smile for whoever was passing and a slight wave of the hand. The first time Carol remembered having seen Mr. Linden was in the hardware store, talking to a group of young men about weather conditions in the Arctic. The cold can catch you when you're not even thinking about it. It caught me about 30 years ago, and I lost a bit of my finger to frostbite, he had said, holding up his hand so that the small crowd could see where the tip of the second finger on his left hand had been amputated. You must have been all over the world, one of the onlookers had remarked. The lure of seeing new places, different ways of life, has been almost irresistible, Mr. Linden had replied. Now I collect stories about those places, pictures and books about the places I've been and places I'd still like to go someday. I have more than 2,000 books in my collection. Hmm, it surprised me that Mr. Linden has been all over the world because he is African American and history makes it seem like African Americans could not do much once they were free. Carol mentioned this story to her friend Peter, who dismissed the idea at once. John Alvin was up his place doing some repairs on the window frames, and he said it looked like the old guy read the same page of the same book every day. I bet he doesn't even know how to read. Carol didn't believe Peter, but decided not to make a big deal of it, and the matter would have gone completely from her mind if she and her mother hadn't run into Mr. Linden the following April. It was one of those days that the wind, swirling relentlessly from the north, found every opening a poorly buttoned coat offered up, and rattled the windows of Brindle's General Store ominously against their frames. Mr. Linden was waiting while the clerk measured out a pound of coffee beans. Just the thought of a good hot cup of coffee makes me feel warmer, he said in the direction of Carol and her mother. Mr. Linden, do you think I could borrow one of your books one day? Carol's request even surprised her. I'm noticing that Carol is hesitant, like most of the whites, to talk to Mr. Linden, but her love for reading has allowed her to overcome her uncertainty. Mr. Linden looked toward Carol's mother, his brows arched questioningly. Oh, that would be too much of a bother to you, sir, her mother said quickly. What are you noticing about Carol's mother's response to Mr. Linden? Books are meant to be read, Mr. Linden said. If you bring the young lady around, she can have her pick. I'm sure she'll be careful with them. The Glace Bay Library was small and didn't carry many of the adventure books that Carol liked. After she promised her mother that she did really want to expand her reading and would absolutely take care of the books, Carol and her mother made the short trek up the hill to Mr. Linden's house on a Wednesday afternoon. The interior of Mr. Linden's home was bright with sunlight that streamed through the stretched patterned curtains. In the library itself, there were dark green bookcases along the wall, and a small writing desk was in the middle of the rectangular room. The surface of the writing desk was covered with dark leather, and in one corner there was a wooden box that contained a sextant. The window seat that looked out over the bay was just wide enough to sit in, and if you were a 12-year-old girl with a small frame, put your feet up as you read. How does this description of the inside of Mr. Linden's home compare with the description of his home at the beginning of the story? You must really love books, Carol said when she saw just how many books the old sailor had. Books have always been among my most trusted friends, Mr. Linden replied. The best of them allow the mind to wander wherever the author's musings lead. I'm reading the book that's lying there, but the rest are yours to borrow. One book will do, Carol's mom said. Mr. Linden said that he would make the tea and started down the stairs, and her mom went with him. Carol began to read the titles on the spines of the books. Many seemed interesting. She looked again at the window seat where the book Mr. Linden was reading was lying. Like the others, it was old, its marble binding fitting perfectly with the dark green colors of the room. She picked up the book and read the title, Tales from a Dark Sea. There was no author listed. She opened the book where Mr. Linden had placed the flat bookmark. It was page 201 and contained one short paragraph, which, out of curiosity about Mr. Linden, she read. How does this image on this page connect to the ideas in the story? When Esteban grew tired, when his weak leg was harder and harder to kick in the choppy waters, the dolphin would swim ahead of him, slightly to his left, and almost draw him along. He realized how far he was from the shore and how far away the small island in the mouth of the bay still seemed. And yet Esteban had never managed to swim so far before, and the accomplishment filled him with pride and made him try even harder. He wondered if the dolphin knew how proud he was. A sentimental story, she thought, one that an older person would find enjoyable. The thought came to her that Mr. Linden must indeed be lonely, and that's why he spent his evenings reading. She placed the book carefully down where it had lain before and quickly picked another from the shelf to borrow. When she brought it downstairs, Mr. Linden took it in his hands carefully, almost lovingly, and read the title. Dahomey and the Dahomeans, he asked, turning the book over in his hands. A surprising choice, but that is the pleasure of reading, isn't it? Books have the ability to take the mind to strange places and in strange ways. Well enjoyed, young lady. That evening over dinner, Carol mentioned that she had expected Mr. Linden's library to be stranger. You mean like little ivory carvings of mermaids? Her mom asked, smiling. I don't know, just the way he goes on about books. He kind of glows when he talks about them. And did you see the way he handled the book I borrowed? Book lovers love books, her mother announced. There's a romance about the books, even having them seem to have a different kind of excitement. The Book of Dahomey, especially the story about the little African girl brought to England, had been quite interesting. And Carol was eager not only to find another interesting story, but also to see what other kinds of book Mr. Linden liked. It took 4 calls to Mr. Linden before they found him. He seemed pleased that you liked the book, Carol's mother said. He asked if we would prefer tea or coffee. I insisted that we didn't need either, of course. Oh, I wouldn't mind discussing books over a cup of tea, Carol said. It fits my image. Today's image, her mother teased. Tomorrow we'll go to see Mr. Linden. You'll make a selection and we'll be out of his hair. Agreed? Carol agreed. During the night, she wondered if Mr. Linden missed going to sea. And by the time she and her mother started off for his place, she was convinced he did miss the adventures of his youth. We're going to stop here for today, but before we go, I want you to get one sheet of paper and write down the character traits you noticed about Carol. Can't wait to see you at part 2 of Mr. Linden's Library.